know that some clinics will give out a leaflet that's maybe sort of 30 pages long about IVF, and it tells you everything in one go. And it's probably just information overload and not very well written.
That's our guest today, fertility consultant Matt Pryor, talking about why he wants to make sure you know where to get information you can trust and what he's created with the Big Fertility Project, which I hope you'll agree is a really brilliant idea. Have a listen. For over 6 years now, the Fertility Podcast has been sharing content with you, talking about the A to Z of things that might be affecting your fertility. And as we head into our 7th year, things are changing. You see, the podcast is just a portal into a world of more support, which ultimately is what you need more than ever when you're trying to conceive. So who are we? Well, I'm Natalie Silverman. If you've listened to the podcast, you'll know. I used to be on the radio. I'm also a professional voiceover, so I basically talk a lot for a living. And I launched this podcast after successful fertility treatment. And in 2019, I brought in the brilliant Kate Davis. Kate is a fertility nurse consultant. You know what you're talking about, and you offer amazing clinical support.
I think it's great to give information out to people this way because it's so accessible. We know from talking to our guests that actually they love listening to it in this way because certainly with men, they can listen to it and no one else knows that they're listening to information about fertility.
Now, part of what is changing with the podcast is that Kate and I are offering an amazing support network. And so what we want to do is offer you the chance to be a patron of this podcast.
So what does all of this mean? You're going to get shout outs on the podcast and your name, if you want it, or it can be your social media handle, will be on the Fertility Podcast website. We're going to be having some awesome monthly get-togethers and we're going to take the time to answer your questions and bring in some fab speakers. And if there's someone you've been really wanting to hear from, you can have a say on who we interview going forward, as we'll be running polls for you to vote on. You'll get early access to our episodes a week ahead of their release. Plus, there's going to be other really useful resources too.
So what you need to do is get on the case and join us today. It's very simple. Just go to patreon.com/the Fertility Podcast. The early years from the Fertility Podcast, where we aim to talk about the stuff you wish you had known before trying to conceive. Now, as you know, the Fertility Podcast is all about empowering you in the next steps in your fertility journey. And we're always delighted to find people who are on the same mission as we are. So we give a massive welcome to Merck, a new sponsor of the Fertility Podcast. They are a leading science and technology company with a rich history in the area of fertility. And with this experience, Merck has launched Bloom, a brand new website intending to provide you with information whether you're looking to start your family or grow it and you need some help on what you're going to do next. So to find out more, just visit merckbloom.com. So we're now going to welcome to the podcast Matt Pryor, who is a fertility specialist, and Matt is the founder of the Big Fertility Project, which you might well be following on your social media. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
It's great to have you, Matt, and I'm so intrigued about everything we're going to talk to you today. And you're going to talk to us a bit about the Big Fertility Project, and I'm really keen to find out a bit more about this and particularly where the idea originated from.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I've listened to you for quite some time now and think it's a brilliant resource for people with fertility problems. And that's really where kind of my interest has sparked from. So I'm a consultant at Newcastle Fertility Centre up in the northeast. And patient information is something that's really kind of bothered me for quite some time. And that's really where the Big Fertility Project came from. And it was really kind of my frustration based around the fact that there's so much stuff out there about fertility from different places. So on the one hand, you've got kind of the really kind of boring, dry stuff that either kind of professional societies or your clinic might give you if you go along with patient information. And traditionally, that's a bit of paper. It's really dryly written and not very interesting for patients. And honestly speaking, I don't know how many times you've been given patient information from doctors, but I'm not sure how much you've actually read it. So that's one side of things. Have you experienced that at all?
Definitely. You know, it's that handout, isn't it, that you're given that perhaps you might give a quick read through really quickly, skim read it, but actually probably not taking much of the information in.
And my experience was overwhelming paperwork that we were just like, exactly that, overwhelmed. And I mean, this was when I had treatment, it was 6 years ago, so there wasn't anywhere near what there is now.
Exactly. And it seems like you say, completely overwhelming. I know that some clinics will give out a leaflet that's maybe sort of 30 pages long about IVF, and it tells you everything in one go. And it's probably just information overload and not very well written. So that's one side of things. And then kind of the other side of things is you get lots of patients who want to talk about their fertility experiences and their stories and their journeys. And some of that may be kind of through blogs or online, or there's even people now who have their own kind of social media account just to document their fertility journey. And I think they're really fascinating stories and really interesting, but perhaps not necessarily the first place that patients should go to get advice about their own fertility journey. So that's kind of the next strand of where information is coming from. And then finally, you've got the commercialization of fertility. So lots of other stuff might be put out there by either private clinics or companies that offer private tests or investigations. And you kind of just need to be a little bit cautious as to the quality of that and whether it's biased. And then finally, you've got the traditional media, whether it's like comes to mind, dailymail.com, where there might be something in the news and all of a sudden it says a new thing triples IVF success rates, and it just over sensationalizes things. So it's really difficult to do it. So that kind of, that's where I saw the problem with information, is there's information from lots of different places and not very often is it brought together. And I thought that really through kind of some of the research I did when I was doing my PhD, which perhaps we'll touch on slightly, I saw the power of kind of collaboration between professionals and patients to try and do something a little bit better than what we have at the moment. So that's sort of an introduction to what the Big Fertility Project is.
With that in mind, then, do you want to tell us a bit more about your research? Because I think that was looking at more at the patient experience, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I kind of realised quite early into my training that reproductive medicine and fertility was something that I really wanted to go towards. And to become a subspecialist in that, one of the requirements is to have done some research, which is normally like a higher degree. So I went off to do a PhD, not because I'm an academic and really wanted to kind of do lab-based things, but partly as kind of the hurdle you have to jump over to become a fertility specialist. So I went to Nottingham to do that. And kind of the boring side of it was trying to set up a clinical trial, looking at something very specific. But the thing that really sort of interested me and made a difference was looking at how research is prioritised. And I ran something called the Miscarriage Priority Setting Partnership, which some of you might have heard of. And the background to that is essentially researchers in the past research things that either interest them or are paid for by the pharmaceutical industry. And realistically, the research questions that should be answered are the ones that actually are important to patients, that patients think are the questions that they want answering. So I went through a process for miscarriage to set the research agenda, which involved various surveys, engagement with patient groups. And then eventually through this collaborative process, we came up a list of like the top 10 things that should be researched in miscarriage. And on the back of that, that sets the research agenda for funding organisations to support research studies that help answer those questions. So that's sort of the first time I sort of saw the power of like collaboration between patients and professionals, was to come up with those kind of research priorities.
Can the public read the research? Is it available? Can we share it in the show notes?
You can. All you would need to do is, I think, go into Google and type Miscarriage Priority Setting Partnership, and that would come up. Okay. It's a very accessible kind of academic paper that was published. And also it's run by an organisation called the James Lind Alliance, which is a national organisation funded by the government who do various ones of these priority setting partnerships. There has been one done into fertility more recently, and they've done it for lots of different conditions. And everyone asked, like, who's James Lind? He was the man who did the very first randomised controlled trial many years back, you know, when I think they had different boats going out to sea in the Navy and had problems with scurvy, and they gave each boat something different, and that's how they discovered that actually it was vitamin C that caused scurvy, deficiency that caused scurvy.
Because I know that some people love to get stuck into the papers, whereas other people find that too overwhelming.
I know,
and that's
exactly.
where, like, we recently shared a miscarriage series for that very reason, that there's still, again, an overwhelm of information and people not really understanding. And so I think you've got to then decide what's right for you in how you're going to consume it, which is what you're obviously hoping is. You're curating it ultimately, aren't you?
Yeah, ultimately trying to find kind of good sources of reliable information and try and make it a bit more accessible to patients by either presenting it in a better way or aligning it with people who want to share their fertility stories and be able to kind of tell it in a kind of more engaging way and make it more accessible rather than just dry information that's found online. It's kind of bringing things together.
So with that in mind, and the kind of like the dry information, and then the other extreme, which are influencers, what do you think about influencers and the information that they give out? And do you see that as helpful or potentially not so helpful?
And you're talking about social media influencers, Kate.
Yeah. Well, I think kind of the world we live in now, social media influencers are kind of really important. And there are some fantastic influencers out there. Kind of people who spring to mind are Gynaegeek. So Anita Mitra, she's fantastic and has really kind of put women's health and gynecology, which is a word that I hate, put that kind of more at the forefront. And I think that's been like really good. But you do have to be really careful kind of, I suppose, when it's not professionals or even when it's people who perhaps you always got to think who's paying this person, especially when you're looking at influencers who might be promoting products. You need to be a little bit more cautious. And I think like anything, you've always got to look what the source is behind the information and what evidence they have to back it up. So there's kind of pros and cons.
And I'm also interested then, Matt, when it comes to social media. So I, for example, have got a closed Facebook group and somebody was asking a question the other day and patients were sharing their experience of what it was that this particular lady was about to go through. And so that is literally lived experience from the horse's mouth that the clinics aren't necessarily on hand enough to answer. And I'll always, where possible, if I can, I'll try and tag Kate in, for example, as my expert in my community, or I'll try and signpost people to previous podcast episodes that I feel might have already discussed what they're asking. But how do you feel about that then when there are threads on different social media platforms? And it is the patient expert point, isn't it? That if people are sharing their own experience of it, because we are also individual.
I think that's kind of like the key to it really, is that everyone's experience is really helpful, but it doesn't necessarily mean, and it's helpful kind of from a support point of view as well. If you're going through a fertility problem, to know that you're not alone and other people have gone through it can be like a huge sort of area of support, which is great. The downside is that you've got to remember that everyone's experience is also different. Everyone is an individual. So perhaps if you read something negative, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's definitely going to happen to you. So that's why I think it's important to have kind of both working together, because a patient is only ever going to have their own experience, whereas a clinician, I suppose, like me, I'm never going to know what it's like to have an egg collection or an internal scan, but I've kind of have that experience to see that lots of people tolerate that differently and have a different experience. And I suppose it's important to be aware of all those different views.
If patients want to kind of share their stories with you to help with the Big Fertility Project, and obviously, and I know you want to bring clinicians and patients together, how can they do that? And what is it that you want to learn from them?
So essentially, we did have a website that we're going to launch, but I think with all these things, it becomes quite difficult, especially when, and the reason why it's called the Big Fertility Project is not because we kind of have a huge ego, but it needs to be bigger than just kind of like myself and a group of professionals and students. It also needs to involve kind of the professional societies, patient groups. So it's really kind of like a big tent rather than kind of just one particular person leading it. So it really partly depends on what it's going to evolve into. But at the moment, we have decided to stick to kind of Instagram as a great way to be able to share stories and information. Depending on when this podcast is kind of released, the best way to find us is on Instagram, which is just Big Fertility Project. And the way to contact us is either via a message on there, or if you look at the website, which is bigfertilityproject.com, there will be links with email addresses to say, look, you really want to be involved, and not just necessarily to share kind of your own story, because some people, quite rightly with fertility, want to keep things very private, might want to speak about things anonymously, but also to help curate and guide where some of that content is going so that it can be more useful for other people kind of in a similar position to yourself. So we're really looking for lots of people to get involved.
Well, I'm sure, certainly, because obviously Natalie and I speak to so many people on the podcast that I'm sure we can certainly put some people your way for sure to help as well. So we'll definitely be looking out for that.
And with that in mind, Matt, if you've got various people writing their experiences about a certain condition or maybe their experience of treatment, and then obviously you've got this team of experts, medical students and all your writers involved, are you kind of saying that then you'll kind of give it your professional overview before you're sharing it? Because otherwise, does it not just become a place where people can just put their thoughts out?
Exactly. So that's kind of the beauty of it, in that it's not just a place where you necessarily would just put things out straight away. It's about where it is curated between kind of patients and professionals, so that there's that viewpoint that's given across as this is my experience, but this is perhaps another place or research that we might guide you towards, which has evidence behind it, that has the science behind it. And this is the patient story. So kind of bringing all those different strands that I talked about at the beginning together.
Great. So we're kind of doing a call to action for people listening, really, because you want stories, you want experience. So we'll make sure your Insta is on here and
thank you.
People can get in touch. So people just want to get on the case, start following you and start getting in touch and ultimately submitting their experiences to you. Then we can all kind of pool our resources, can't we?
Yeah, that's right. So we have launched in July. And depending on when this goes out, if you have a look, you'll be able to see all the different types and styles of pieces that we're posting and see how you'll be able to fit into that. One of the things that we don't have is we're not very good at kind of writing or telling interesting stories, and we quite easily, that's why we end up writing really dry information leaflets. So anybody certainly who's had any experience kind of writing, social media, marketing, we'd be really keen to hear from those types of people.
Good stuff. Well, good luck. We'll do what we can to rally up the troops to get the fertility tribe on the case, Matt. And good luck with it, because I think it's a really good mix of putting our heads together, which is something that Kate and I are big fans of. And before we let you go, the pair of you are both now linked together in an exciting new project, doing virtual consultations with Dr. Fertility. So, Matt, just tell me a bit about how you feel about this online video consultation world that we're now going to be more in light of what's been going on with the pandemic.
I think it's really helpful, and especially when it comes to something like fertility, it's a really useful way of being able to have a kind of discussion about your fertility and consultation online. A lot of clinics now, and it's almost given the NHS a bit of a kick up the backside into the 21st century, and certainly at our clinic now we're doing video and telephone consultations. And as a clinician, I find them really useful way. And obviously it avoids patients having to come to the clinic, which can sometimes be a bit of a scary experience. So it gives that sort of more useful introduction. So I think that's helpful. And patients seem a little bit more at ease being able to have a conversation from their own home rather than actually coming into kind of a scary fertility clinic.
Well, I know it's something, Kate, you've always said, and I'm just keen from your point of view, Kate, as a fertility nurse consultant, there's obviously a conversation people can have with you or they can have with Matt, a fertility specialist. So just kind of explain the difference between the two conversations.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Matt and I have been kind of working out the difference as we go along, because this with Dr. Fertility is quite a new thing. I think the main difference is that I'm not a prescriber and Matt is a prescriber. So Matt will be able to prescribe, which is fantastic. But it's early days and we're seeing where this all takes us, but it's really exciting. And I've been, as you know, Natalie, flying the flag for online consultations for the last 6 years. And I think it's the best thing ever. As long as I can see my patient by video, then it's as though they're sat in my office, and I absolutely love it. And like you say, Matt, there's nothing better than consulting someone who's sat on their own couch and feels so much more relaxed. They haven't had to have that awful journey into the clinic, or the anxieties that come with actually having to step over that threshold. I think it adds definitely something to the consultation. So that's definitely one good thing to come out of lockdown for the NHS as well.
And especially as we know that a lot of these appointments, if people are having to go to clinics, are likely to just be the woman rather than her partner. So with the video consultation, you can see them both.
Yes.
Obviously.
Yeah,
potentially.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, you can see both. And it's so important for kind of both partners to be there, just because quite often and I'm sure this has come up so many times in fertility, the male partner sometimes goes a little bit, gets a bit lost or left behind. And I think that being able to involve the male partner and men in this is really important. And it should, to be honest, be the case whether it's in clinic or with a video consultation. But it's a good way to be able to do it over video.
Well, good luck with it, both
Thank
of you.
you.
And Matt, thank you for your time. It was lovely to chat.
Thanks, Matt.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care. We hope you enjoyed the show. All the info of our guests will be just below this episode in whichever podcast app you're listening in.
And remember, if you do just one new thing today to help you get even more support on your fertility journey, why not become a Patreon of the podcast? Just visit patreon.com/The Fertility Podcast.